And Minister Megan Woods and Gerry Brownlee are my guests this evening, and they join me right now. Good evening to you both.
Good evening, Chris.
Minister, to you first. The government's omission of any COVID-19 strategy for the South Island, that did get up the noses of many people, including business people here in the South Island, and in fact a health professor from Dunedin saying this is a perfect chance for the government to say what it's going to do for the South Island while the South Island remains COVID-free for over a year. What's your response to that?
Yeah, so look, Chris, I don't really accept the premise of your question, a mission for a strategy for the South Island. There is a really clear strategy for New Zealand, and the South Island is part of that. And that's about us containing the virus where it currently is by using hard borders in the areas where it is. There have been some people in the South Island that have been saying, why don't we just cut it off at Cook Strait and why don't we cut off the South Island? Now, that's not everybody. I think there's a real range of views, certainly within Christchurch, that I'm hearing. I'm equally hearing from as many people saying, for goodness sake, don't do that. They're reliant either for personal or for family reasons or for their businesses or their work to be able to travel and be able to go back and forth to parts of the North Island that do not have COVID at the moment. The other thing that I'd be really worried about would be our supply chains here into the South Island. Things are really tight as it is. We need to ensure that we're getting goods and services continuing to flow across the strait. The most important protection that the South Island can have is that everyone needs to put that armour on, and it's called vaccination. And we've really got to get a collective push here throughout the South Island and in Christchurch of making sure as many people as possible can get their vaccine.
Gerry, what do you make of the calls to at least have some kind of regional border? I think it was Professor Nick Wilson from Otago University who has been mentioning this, similar to what they've done in Tasmania, and he says that's been a success. What do you say?
Well, I think probably we've got to a point now, particularly where today the government is saying, or the authorities are saying, the 77 new cases in Auckland are likely to grow over the next short while. And so you're getting a very big number of people infected up there. That reduced people movement might be a good thing between the two islands. That doesn't mean you have to cut off supply chains, because, of course, a lot of supply gets driven to Wellington, put on the ferry and picked up by new drivers and picked in. So there's ways around that. But then the other thing that's got to happen is a tightening up of why people get border exemptions. And this latest case in Blenheim is a perfect example of that. How did those two sex workers manage to get across Cook Strait to a hotel in Blenheim to apply their trade, presumably?
Yeah. Just on that, Chris, can I just say that the issue around the truck drivers, that this is actually something we have looked at quite extensively about whether or not we could keep the supply chains going and just have someone drive it on in Wellington, drive it off in Picton, being a different person, so you didn't have to have that cost crossing into the strait. Well, that works for a number of our large freight companies. There's still a lot of goods that don't move with our large freight companies that have the capacity to do that. So that is something we have looked at. But I think the thing that we have to bear in mind is that there is restriction of movement across that border at the moment. You cannot legally, without good reason, travel across that border. Now, we have had some examples of people leaving places where they shouldn't. They are breaking the law, and they will be dealt with accordingly. So even if we had that hard border, we'd still have people breaking the law as we are now.
How do they get those exemptions? That's the real question. I mean, it's extraordinary.
Gerry, I don't know. I don't know.
It appears that they have fraudulently managed to get some sort of exemption so that they could hand over to the police and say, look, this is why we're an essential worker. I think, I would have thought that, after a couple of weeks of this stuff, that there might have been a greater tightening up of exactly how you get those exemptions. If we are to be gripped as we are, with both the reduced movement of all New Zealanders as a result of the Delta outbreak, then I would have thought the containment policy that you're talking about should have at its heart had very strong bureaucratic processes around the granting of exemptions.
So I can't speak to the Blenheim case, but I know that certainly in the Northland case, it wasn't even that an exemption had been granted. There were fraudulent documents that were used in that case. They were forged, so those people didn't have an exemption to cross the border, and these people were simply breaking the law and need to be dealt with accordingly.
I want to move on because we haven't got much time, but I do want to discuss the Christchurch City Council is considering leaving local government New Zealand. And interestingly enough, this is being spearheaded by two city councillors at opposite ends of the political spectrum, Jake McClellan and, of course, Sam McDonald. Gerry, do you think that it is time for the council to leave local government New Zealand, because apparently they don't seem to be listening to councils when it comes to the government's controversial water reforms? What do you say?
Well, I think it's time for local government New Zealand to have a good look at itself as a representative body of all of the councils. And so a clearinghouse, if you like, for stuff that's of issue to councils. But where they turn around and take a particularly hard line in favour of a particular position, as they have done with the waters, they've sort of wishy-washy themselves back from that a little bit. Then I think we've got an absolute right as ratepayers who support the City Council's position on the three waters, which is not in favour of the proposals, to see that the money, that ratepayer money, is not spent on an opposing advocate.
Megan?
Well, I understand what they voted on yesterday was a report about the implications of leaving local government New Zealand. So it wasn't actually a vote on leaving local government New Zealand as such. I think that we've seen the comments from Stuart Crosby today from local government New Zealand. They acknowledge that they need to do some communication back with their stakeholders, their member councils. We've already seen Timaru leave. And I think certainly that they acknowledge that they've got to do some communication back with the local councils, who is their membership. They are the peak body for these councils, that they need to they need to look at those relationships. And I think that this will be a wake-up call for them.
The question is, though, is local government NZ a bit of an irrelevancy now? Because everything I've read, it's just another layer to the government. Get rid of that layer and you've got, you're saving taxpayers and ratepayers a lot of cash. Gerry?
Well, if you look at us right now on a Zoom call, thousands, tens of thousands of New Zealand, hundreds of thousands of New Zealanders are working daily using this sort of communication tool. In the old days, when local government New Zealand was first formed, a telegram was the fastest way you get a piece of information from one to the other, or a very long, expensive phone call. So things have changed a bit, and I think the access to central government particularly is a lot clearer these days. And so the idea that you need to have is a subset of government, this sort of clearinghouse, local government New Zealand, big organisation to represent all the others is a thing of the past.
I was trying to see where you're going with that telegraph thing. House prices in Christchurch. Minister...
You want to hear about my views on local government New Zealand, Chris?
Okay, 30 seconds.
No.
Give me my turn. Look, I think that it does actually have some utility. Remember that when you meet with local government New Zealand, the committees of it are made up from mayors of various parts of the country, so it's not faceless bureaucrats within that organisation. It can be a good way to have some engagement more broadly across a range of local bodies to get a feeling with what the rural mayors are thinking, what the urban mayors are thinking. So I think it does have some utility.
Okay. And with a telegram or without a telegram, I suppose.
I'm impressed by your uptake of tech, Gerry. It's really to be commended.
You're doing good.
Thanks. It wasn't me who had trouble setting his screen prior to this.
That's true. Listen, house prices, absolutely obscene, even in Christchurch now. Minister, under your watch, house prices now have risen. In fact, do you know what the average national price is for a home in New Zealand?
Yes, I do, but I don't have it right on the tip of my tongue. It's obviously something we track pretty closely, and it does obviously differ in different parts of the country. That we saw a hugely out of control runaway hyperinflation in house prices the latter part of last year and the beginning of this year, and this was in line with what was happening around the OECD as countries came out of their kind of COVID cocoons and back back into the world. What we have seen is some stemming of that level of growth since the measures were put in place in March, that we made the changes in March.
Are you sure? What about the case? Can you really say that a case in Sumner House, $600,000, two-bedroom place goes for well over $1.4 million? That's not stemming growth. That's obscene.
No, most of that growth happened at the end of last year and the beginning of this year. What we have seen, I acknowledge there is still growth in house prices happening, but we're not seeing the runaway numbers that we were seeing at the end of last year and the beginning of this year, that it has curbed it a bit. Of course, the levers that we've put in place to encourage property investors to look at new builds rather than competing with first-home buyers is starting to take hold. What we're seeing here in Christchurch is a growth actually in first-home buyers entering the market, which I think is something to be commended. But look, there is no silver magic bullet for housing. I think everybody knows that. There's a range of measures that we need to continue to plug away at. One is we need to make sure that we've got enough land to build on. And we need to look at ways in which we can bring forward even some of the plans that we've got in place around that in terms of our national policy statement on urban development, how it is that we can even kind of hurry that along even more. This makes councils in Tier 1, so Christchurch City being one, have to have a plan for the growth that's projected in their area, where the houses are going to go, but importantly, to include in their long-term plans the cost of their share of the infrastructure that's going to have to be there to support that house building. And of course, the government has set up the Housing Acceleration Fund, because it's not just a matter of zoning land, it's about having build-ready land that's actually got the infrastructure that means you can put the houses on top of it. So not claiming our job is done yet by any means, Chris. It is an ongoing project.
Gerry, you can't buy a home in Christchurch now for under $750,000, a new home that is. You can buy a lot of dog kennels though, and these dog kennels are popping up quite a lot all over the city, places like Murrayvale, Woolston. Does that concern you? A lot of these infills where they're smashing down older homes from the 60s and 70s and putting in about 12 dog kennels. That to me sounds like eventually a recipe for disaster when it comes to creating a community. What do you think?
Well, look, I'm not going to make a comment on that. I think in the end, they're being sold. People are buying them. I think the real problem is lack of supply of land. It is also the fact that you'd say the impediments to property development now are just absolutely enormous, and councils are a big part of that. But look, you just look at that $700,000 for the brand new house. $100,000 of that goes straight into GST. So you've got to ask yourself if there's some room there for the government to come up with something that might be of assistance to first home buyers in particular, greater than we offer at the present time. The second point I'd make is if you listen to what Megan has just said, you'd swear it was all sort of under control and no worries. In a few minutes, there's going to be a whole lot of new stuff out there and it'll all come right. When is the time where we'll start to see some legislation that actually puts a bit of life into the concept of requiring councils to make land available for new subdivisions? Because that was what happened here in Christchurch. We were able to do it because of the urban development strategy. Eventually you saw land conceded for about 48,000 sections. So we're starting to run out of that at the present time. The other thing is, of course, on the infill issue, I'm not too concerned that in the inner city you're getting more of that infill. But in the end, it's that new house price that actually drives the second-hand price, and a big chunk of that new house price is tax.
Megan, I'll give you a final word, then we've got to go.
Sorry, Chris, but we are working how it is that we can bring forward those obligations on councils to need to actually say this is what the growth in our region looks like. At the moment, it's the National Policy Statement on Urban Development. We've got the first draft of kind of things through from councils. I want to see more momentum, and we haven't made any secret of that, so I have been doing work on that. But it is about having the infrastructure that... The fact of the matter is we have not for decades had central government investing in infrastructure, and this is not about Labour or National. This goes back decades and decades. It covers multiple terms of both our parties. Since the 1970s that we've seen government investing in any meaningful way in making build-ready land, and that's what our Housing Acceleration Fund is about.
No, you can't accuse our government of not doing that. We did, and Christchurch was a dramatic example of that. Look, the other thing is, don't get hung up on this infrastructure idea. The reality is that as soon as land is consented for sections, sold for building sites, the council has a rating base. What else are rates for, if not in the first instance, to pay for infrastructure? So I think there's a lot of discussion that needs to be had with councils about some of their, holding their hand out too darn much on that. And don't forget that there are development levies charged by councils for every single section that's created. So I don't take too much of an obligation on that. I've been getting stuck into them. Here is the law. This is what you must comply with. Get on with it.
And Gerry, that's exactly what's happening. But we, for decades in this country, have seen underinvestment by councils in their infrastructure. Christchurch is a special case because of the earthquakes. If you look at places like Gisborne, if you look at places like Wanganui, small rating bases, there just has not been the investment in the pipes under the ground to allow for houses to be built. We can't just continue as we have been and expect anything to be different. We've got to start thinking differently if we're going to solve the housing crisis.
Every time they create a new section, they create a funding base, and they shouldn't be allowed to out of that.
Yep, but they haven't been, and we're not seeing it happening.
We're out of time. Minister Megan Woods and Gerry Brownlee, thank you so much for your time this evening. Good discussion.
Thank you.